My name is Beth Groth, and I'm a planner with the Planning Growth Management Department. And I want to talk a little bit today about the county's climate initiatives, what we're doing for climate change. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the Climate Leadership Academy. So before we get into the Climate Leadership Academy, we kind of need to talk about what climate change is. And we start with its patterns of weather over a long period of time. So when you get up in the morning and you turn on the TV and you're seeing what's on the weather, so you know if you have to grab an umbrella or a coat, that's what weather is, a day-to-day, what's happening outside your window. But climate, on the other hand, is looking at those average patterns of weather and over a very long period of time. And they're tied to regions and areas. So we have a local climate here, we're in a temperate climate, and that means that we see all 4 seasons of the year, and we experience a certain type of climate, whereas Texas is more dry and warm, and they experience a different type of climate. And so that you understand what climate is, when we talk about climate change is just essentially the change in the climate patterns. So climate change is impacting everywhere, basically, in the entire globe. And locally, in Charles County, it's impacting us as well. And ways that it's impacting us, in 2018, you probably remember how wet of a year it was. And in fact, it was the wettest year on record. And then 2019 followed up and had quite a few rainy days as well. So the impacts that we're seeing locally are an increase in extreme weather. So hurricanes are becoming much stronger and causing more damage, and we're seeing more of them as well. And then we're also seeing localized flooding in terms of urban and nuisance flooding. And nuisance flooding is a term that we use when we talk about tidal flooding. And it also is referred to as sunny day flooding. So you could see something flooding, but there's not actually any rain happening, and that's because the tidal influence, and we're just seeing higher levels of rainfall, and that's impacting areas and causing nuisance flooding. So another impact of climate change or global warming is the increase in global temperature. And why this is a concern is that locally we'll see an increase in the number of very warm or hot days. Typically we have several over a year over a summer that are very high, and we get extreme air quality warnings, and that number of days is supposed to increase over the next few years. And so a lot of people may be thinking, well, why does this matter to me? You know, I can stay inside and be in the air conditioning and not worry about it. The thing about global warming is that it doesn't impact everywhere the same. And so we're going to see definitely increasing heat, and other places could see increasing cold. But it also affects, again, precipitation in terms of whether we see more rain or more drought events. And we'll likely see both. Some years we'll see more drought, and some years we'll see more rain. With all of these issues with climate change, it's important to know that Charles County is being proactive, and we are taking steps now to prepare for the future. And several of the things that we're doing fall in kind of 2 buckets. We have the mitigation side and we have the adaptation side. And in terms of mitigation, what I mean by that is we're mitigating climate change. So we're trying to mitigate for the greenhouse gas emissions that are leaving our buildings because of the power usage, and our cars and all of the things that are creating these greenhouse gases. We're trying to mitigate to reduce them. And so some projects that we're working on are some solar facilities that we're trying to create one is going to be on the Pisgah landfill. And so we're mitigating because solar is a renewable energy, and it doesn't require fossil fuels to operate, and it provides power. And other projects, so we have several solar projects like that. And in terms of adaptation, this is what we consider resilience. And resilience means that we're able to bounce back from from extreme events much more quickly. And that's very important because I'm sure many of you will remember the tornado that happened in 2002, and that took quite a while to recover from. And so if we can make things in our county, our transportation system, our energy system more resilient, our buildings more resilient to climate change, then we will be able to bounce back much more quickly from events that happen. So another thing that Charles County is doing is we are now trying to educate our workforce on climate change and ensure that they have the information necessary to do the work that we do at Charles County, but to consider climate change and make sure that we're making the best decisions in terms of long-term projects and efforts. And so the Maryland Climate Leadership Academy is one way that we have started to educate employees, and this is an effort through the state of Maryland and the Association of Climate Change Officers that put together this training, and several of the staff members here at Charles County Government have gone through the program. There's also a credentialing aspect where you can become what's called a climate change professional, and we have a couple of those in the county now as well. And this program has been great because it gives everybody sort of the background knowledge they need about climate change, and then gives them tools they need to apply and work within their work to figure out the best methods for mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Lowry, and I'm the Environmental Compliance Manager with Charles County Public Works in the Environmental Resources Division. In the Climate Leadership Academy, I learned the present issues, I learned about the regulatory issues that we're having, but also how it can directly impact my job. So for instance, the current precipitation or current anticipated precipitation totals for Maryland and specifically Charles County, and how it would impact us over at the landfill or our wastewater treatment plants, and how we'll have to plan ahead or plan forward for these changes and adaptations. I think how I'm going to apply my knowledge that I gained at the Climate Leadership Academy is having to look 5, 10, but even 50 years into the future as we keep expanding on our modeling knowledge about how much our climate is going to change, that is going to impact the decisions that we make today, because we're going to need to plan for 50 more inches of rain, a year or this or that we haven't had to do before. So I think largely it's going to impact how we plan our future projects.
Applying for jobs with Charles County government is now easier and more efficient. Visit www.charlescountymd.gov for more information.
When we talk about African-American history, we can talk about slavery, and we can talk about the civil rights movement, and for many of us that sort of seems to start with Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. And yet we don't know a lot about the history between the end of slavery and the start of what we think of as the start of the civil rights movement. And it's important to understand that history, to know that people were successful, but that there were just everyday people like Mr. Farrar who came, he worked hard, and life was happening. And the trouble is that a lot of people just don't think about that history in that way.
So the Blue Jay Motel is an interesting landmark in Charles County that many may not be familiar with. The marker tells the story of Arthur Farrar, who was a self-made African-American businessman who acquired 30 acres in northern Waldorf during the 40s and 50s.
He was born in Mount Holly, North Carolina, and he left home when he was 12 years old. And he migrated up to West Virginia, and he stayed there for a short time. before going on to Washington, D.C. And during that time, he worked in the restaurant business. He worked for this Jewish gentleman who owned a place called Southern Lunch. And my grandfather was good in making rolls and biscuits and things like that. So eventually, my grandfather, the Jewish guy, wanted to retire. So he had my grandfather buy him out, in which he did. So he had a place up there for a few years. And then he had the opportunity, the way he came down to Charles County, he had the opportunity to buy property from Mr. Lewis Jefferson. And Mr. Jefferson had a lot of property in D.C., apartment buildings, he had row houses, businesses, and things like that. So he asked my grandfather that he wanted to purchase some land. So my grandfather said, yes, I guess, yeah, I will. So he sold him, Mr. Jefferson sold him 26 acres. He had 14 acres on 925 and 12 acres on 301.
Arthur was a remarkable man. I just don't understand how he accomplished all the things that he did. Some of the places and some of the things that he had. He had about 13 homes that he rented out. And of course, one of them was a log cabin. And he had 3 apartment buildings, and a filling station, and a car wash, pool room, a dance hall, skating ring, and at one time he had a sawmill. He built a baseball diamond with a team called the BBs. I'm telling you, it goes on and on. And then he built the Bluebird, and then in 1952, maybe 53, the state highway redid 301. And they came right down through the middle of his baseball diamond. And so with the money that he got from the state, he built the Blue Jay Motel on 301.
US 301 had a series of motels along the road, and there were also gas stations that were available for travelers to stay, because 301 was supposed to be the shortcut between Richmond and Baltimore and points north and south of one of those 2 cities, so that you would avoid, not necessarily avoid Washington, D.C., but not have to drive on US 1, which was a very crowded and very narrow road that the state did not really have the ability to expand. So a number of the motels were for whites only. So the Farrars and other people down in Faulkner had also built a second motel called the Blue Star. So those both were available for African Americans to stay in. And there were other places in Upper Marlboro where African Americans could stay. Generally, if there was a sizable population of African Americans, there would be a hotel or a motel or at least a tourist home where somebody could spend the night.
Blue Jay, my grandfather and father built it. Some of the Amish from St. Mary's County came up, some local people, relatives. George's father probably was involved, and they built it little by degree. And they decided it was all on one floor from the beginning. And then they eventually added on the unit rooms on the left side of the building, and they put up seven rooms up there.
He got the idea when he used to go south, he couldn't find a place to stay, and it was one place that was black owned in Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, and he used to stay there, and that's where he got the idea from the motel.
It was an important business in Waldorf during an era of segregation. So what's interesting about the Blue Jay Motel is that many people have seen the movie The Green Book, and that tells the story of an African-American musician traveling through the segregated South. And it sort of paints a picture of how difficult and actually dangerous travel could be for African Americans who were just looking for things like a place to eat and a place to stay overnight. So the movie really shed light on that story. Well, many people don't realize that Charles County had several sites that were listed in the Green Book. The Green Book was a guide for African Americans traveling through the South.
The Blue Jay was listed in the Green Book between 1958 and 1967. It was started in 1937 by Victor Hugo and his wife Alma Green. Victor was a postman in New York City. He worked in Brooklyn, and at that point there were lots of African Americans beginning to travel, and they were trying to help them find restaurants or hotels where they could be served and be treated with dignity, because segregation was the law of the land.
During segregation time, you had places that were white only, and you had some places where they called colored at that time, not black, they called colored only. So you had to put up a sign to say, okay, only whites can come in this place, or colored can come in this place, until my grandfather took a bold stand. He decided that he didn't feel that way personally, so he decided to take the colored only down and put welcome. So he wanted everybody to come in. It didn't make any difference. He didn't want to discriminate. So some of the white establishments, they didn't like it, but he had some white friends also, and they decided to do the same thing. So it kind of caught on, and before you know it, I think they lobbied at the courthouse. They had a demonstration there, and all. So since there wasn't a big fight or a big, to do, they decided to, well, let's leave it in the hands of the establishments and just let them do what they want. So I remember distinctly this one situation. It was snowing. I mean, it was in the mid-60s. It was snowing. I mean, it was deep. And this young white couple from Massachusetts, and I was in the Blue Jay at the time. This happened at the Blue Jay. And they were coming from the South, and they were trying to get home, and they had some car trouble. And Sheriff Garner, Buddy Garner, he was a good friend of my dad's and all. I think they had called around the different motels in the county and asked them, would you take in this young couple? They're stranded, and they don't have any money right now, and they're trying to make their way up north. And a lot of them turned them down. And they asked my dad, they called him up, and he said, Roy, he said, listen, I got a young couple with a baby. They had a baby, newborn baby. And my dad said, sure, bring them up. So one of the deputies brought them up, and my grandfather was there, and they put them up in the room. And the guy said they were really nice young couple. And he said as soon as he get back up north, he would send the money down. My father said, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. My grandfather was in the kitchen warming the baby's milk up. It was just funny, seeing this guy warming the baby's milk. But he sent them a note, send them the money back, but they weren't worried about that. They were just glad to help,
So this historic marker is important because Waldorf has changed and redeveloped and grown so much over the decades, and I think a historic marker provides a little bit of context and shares a little bit about the history of this community and how it came to be.
I'm glad it's, somebody decided to have some kind of historical marker there, because as you know, now nobody would even, if they didn't know anything about that, they wouldn't even know anything about the motel, because now, all that's gone.
Before the marker was put up, a lot of people who were from Waldorf or Charles County, even St. Mary's, remember them. They would come up to me sometime, they would say, I would tell them my name, they would go, was Roy your father? I said, yeah. Or big boy, they call your grandfather big boy? I said, yes. And they would say really, really, good things about him. And they left a lasting mark here already. And it's nice to have that marker there too. That way people can come around who didn't know them and read the sign. And that makes me proud of them. Makes me real proud.